Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining us. So this is DMARC session. Today from the chairs crew, we're crew 2 with me and Tim. Let's get started. So I assume people have already seen Note well. If you haven't seen it, please have a look and read relevant documents. So we're using Miteco. If you're hearing this, you're probably in the right place. So this session is being recorded. We have a Jabber room, which is mirrored to the chat in Miteco. So if you appear in either one, it should appear there. We have note-taking. Tim volunteered to be a note-taker, yes?
Yes.
But if Tim missed anything, please go to CodeMD and help him out.
Yes, I'd appreciate that. So.
Right. So this is our agenda. We basically have just split the main DMARC-based document into 3 parts. So this is fairly new. We'll basically discuss a set of topics relevant for each part. In case of DMARC base, there are actually 3 topics. We'll talk about PCT, possibly breaking out organizational domain definition, and policy discovery. Any agenda bashing at this point? I suspect we probably wouldn't use 2 hours for this session, but we'll use as much of it as productive. Yes, did I hear?
Yeah, hi, this is Jim Fenton.
Hi.
I was just looking at the issue tracker, and we've got an awful lot of open issues, and I guess one of the things that I was wondering was that is there a plan to do some sort of an issue scrub at some point?
Yes, absolutely. We should. Chair should get on top of things, and if we have a resolution for any specific issue, we need to declare it. Absolutely.
Okay.
So. Yeah, just a very quick working group status. I already said there are 3 documents we have, which are the main focus of the working group at the moment. But because the documents were published so recently, for this session, there is really no expectation that people read them. I mean, it's nice if people did, but I think it's probably too much to ask on such a short notice. So, let's get started with the first issue on the list. So, it relates to the base document, and the question is, should we keep or should we deprecate the PCT tag? So on the screen is the definition of it. It's a percentage of messages from domain's owner mail stream. And as pointed out on the next slide, what exactly is the problem with this? Well, it's written, implemented, and understood very differently. So for implementations, you can say that there might be implementation bugs, but it's unclear enough and causes enough misinterpretation. So we should figure out what to do with this. So as written, it's applied percentage of all mail. But when people implement, they think it's percentage of failing mail, which are two very different things. And on top of this, there are implementation issues. And then, of course, there are interesting border cases like PCT0 and what's the meaning of things like P equal quarantine with PCT0? Does it mean P equal none? Or what exactly does it mean? And do actually people implement the edge cases correctly? So the question for this group is, do we need it? Consider that there is P equal quarantine. Should we make definition consistent? Let's discuss. Todd, you can go ahead.
Yeah, regarding the perverse incentive of P equal quarantine percent equals 0, I don't know if it's true any longer, but there was a time when if one wanted to get correct reports out of Google, especially mail that was transiting any sort of Google groups, one had to have the P equal quarantine percent equals 0 as a substitute for P equal none in order to get those reports. Again, they may have fixed this. This was several years ago when this was true, but that was the reason, I think, for the perverse incentive in the first place. In general, I'm in favor of getting rid of the percent tag for the reason stated, that it's just probably not implemented correctly, but we'll need to make sure that that won't have any impact on any reports coming out of Google first.
Thank you, Todd. Autumn?
I think I may be one of the stronger advocates for the percent tag, particularly due to P equals quarantine percent equals 0. As Kurt just mentioned, one of the big perverse incentives is mailing lists that will munge headers only if they find an enforcing policy in place. That is a big part of why we do this. I work for Agari, where I help large organizations implement DMARC, quarantine, and reject all the time. And particularly, we see this a lot with Google Groups, but also with a couple of mailing list platforms like groups.io and listserv by Elsoft will munge headers for domains using a quarantine or reject tag, but not using a P equals none, or I guess presumably no DMARC entry at all. And the reason this is a big deal is that some of these large organizations get to a point where everything legitimately sending email from their domain has been properly set to be in compliance with DMARC, and yet they see all of these messages primarily through Google servers, but also through some of these other mailing lists as failing. And I can assure them all day long that when they go to quarantine or reject, those messages will no longer show as failures, but it makes their leadership very nervous and very hesitant to use a restrictive policy. I've been able to break that resistance by having them use P equals quarantine percent equals 0 for a couple weeks and show them that the things that had looked like failures disappear and the traffic is fine. And in that realm, I'm able to get people to adopt a stricter security setting. Whereas without that, they are very risk averse and very uncomfortable with it.
So do you think it's something that we can clarify by additional text one way or the other? So like it's sort of like a special case, PCT equals 0, and even if we take PCT equals 0, PCT out, we can still add text explaining that.
Yes, we could do something like allowing this but not other PCT equals, or allowing some other setting that accomplishes a similar goal would be fine. Now, I have had a couple of organizations that do use percentage tags in the way that it was intended to be used to roll it out slowly. But that's only happened with a couple of my customers, and I think they were people I could probably have talked into doing this without that. one of the biggest exceptions to that was one of the largest email organizations that I've worked with, and that was because they were worried that they would get enough reports back that their upper management might notice and decide something was wrong even though nothing was wrong. So they wanted to kind of slowly test the waters. But I think that is a very small set of people who are in that situation. And I do think that most of them could be convinced to either go along or just make a call that they weren't going to do it anyways. So I don't know that the regular intended use of percentage is as much of a key requirement.
Thank you, Olwen.
Hopefully it's connected correctly. Regarding the percentage tag, in a way, Autumn will also mention it from an implementation perspective. From a practical perspective, I've only seen very useful cases when moving from quarantine to reject in the more restrictive policy component, in a way to test, well, or at least have confidence in enforcing the policies even more. I do recognize that in the earlier stages it's confusing, from in policy none or perhaps in the policy quarantine, but dropping it to actually have a gradual control of moving from quarantine to reject, I might see some difficult issues when running implementations, or at least helping people implement DMARC.
All right, thank you. Jim? We couldn't hear you. I can see you, I couldn't hear you.
I clicked and it didn't make it through. Two things. I was under the impression that if you said P equals none and specified reports, you would still get reports about the failures that were happening. And I kind of thought that was the same thing as saying PCT equals 0. If I'm wrong about that, please let me know. The other thing is, I'm wondering if deprecate is the right term here. We're writing a new standards track specification to replace an informational thing. Do we need to deprecate anything? Shouldn't we if we're not going to do it, don't we just leave PCT out, because this is the first specification, really?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It can be, it doesn't have to be as strong as actually saying not use it, but can just leave it out. But it's still, the question is, if we leave it out, what do we have some wording around why we did it, explaining the reasoning, or so, yeah. All right.
Okay, and I see that Autumn has kind of answered me on the chat. P equals none with reports, you get reports, but not header munging. So thank you.
All right. Okay. Anybody else? Oh yeah, it just, I'm very sorry I wasn't very clear on this. Obviously, all of these discussions will feed to the mailing list discussion, so we cannot really make a decision and declare consensus here, both because we don't have enough people and because this is not how IETF does things. So, yeah, so thank you for the comments. We'll bring them to the mailing list. Right, let's move on to the next topic then. In regards to aggregate reporting, hold on. Yes, in regards to aggregate reporting, a couple of general questions. One is about extensible reporting. What kind of extensibility we should allow? The grammar is quite restrictive at the moment. Yeah, please discuss suggestions, thoughts you have on the topic. Go ahead, Autumn.
All of the extensible options you had in mind, but one thing that comes to mind is that Gmail is including DKIM selectors in their aggregate reports, but that's not common elsewhere, and I really like it, so I'd love to see more of that.
Sounds good. Can you propose a change if it's not?
Sure. To be honest, I'm not familiar enough to say how we would do that. Dave asks why I like having the selectors included. Well, a big part of what I am doing with DMARC data is helping large organizations with multiple email streams try to track down those different email streams. So even if something is fully passing authentication, they don't always, the people I'm talking to are usually a security or IT team for a large organization, maybe a business, maybe a government agency. And a lot of times they have no idea who the people on the ground are who are actually sending these emails. And maybe they've got that somewhere in various ticketing systems somehow, but they don't always know what to query. So when we have selectors included, that is very helpful for them to be able to search their records and maybe figure out who put something in DNS, because they're much more likely to have a DNS record tracked to say, oh, we put in a CNAME or a text record. So it facilitates tracking. And similarly, it's also helpful to figure out if DKIM keys have been rotated, because a number of the organizations that use CNAMEs for DKIM will do automated key rotation, where they might have you implement 3 CNAME records and they'll switch between them every few months. But as an outsider, if you're not looking at the mail traffic, you've got no idea which one is live at any given moment. And so that can be nice for people who have any sort of security requirement to monitor for DKIM key changes. Knowing what selector is currently sending is very helpful. So I'd be happy to see that in DMARC reports. And in terms of how we would make that extensible, I would have to go look at exactly what the aggregate reports look like from Gmail. I don't have one handy, but I believe it just has S equals and then the selector in the same list of format like you would get in other people's aggregate reports.
Right. I think one suggestion was to have more structured data in aggregate records to make them easier to parse. So if there is something that of use, then we should think about that as well. All right, Murray. Murray, would you like to be next?
Sorry, it was, yes, now you're hearing me.
Yes.
We did RFC 8601 recently to revise authentication results, and part of that was to add header.s in support of doing exactly what we're talking about here. So I think that's one that makes sense to do. I thought it was tracked as an issue to do that in particular, but so that's the most common use case I've heard in terms of extending this.
All right, thank you. Todd?
Chat, but it is tracked as an issue, Murray. It's issue 57. Make DKIM selectors required in DMARC reports. So there is already an issue for this.
All right, John?
Can you hear me? My microphone hasn't been working very well. Okay. It's not clear to me what the question is that we are trying to address here. Is it, what other things do we want people to, what other things might we like to have in reports? Or is the question is, how do we put, how do we allow people to put stuff into reports in a way that won't break existing parsers. And 7489 has an XML grammar, which is fine. And I suppose we could put some stuff into the grammar that says add your hacks here. And I guess
yes,
have a
or some text explaining. I think we want both, really.
Okay.
Encourage if there are any specific things that are commonly used, add them right away, as well as some text about where to stuff your extensions.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, because I have an XML parsing script, which I believe does not attempt to enforce the grammar. So it might be, I guess just some comments saying like there might be extra stuff, just ignore it would be a good place to start.
Right, as opposed to just aborting and throwing everything out. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else? Okay, let's talk more about aggregate reporting. The two other obvious things that needs to be done in this area is full text from ARC reporting, if that's becomes the way for dealing with indirect mail flows, and as well as no such domain reporting. If you have comments on these topics, please come to the mic. Sounds like there are no takers on these, but okay. Okay, John, go ahead.
I guess what I said in the chat is these both seem reasonable, and I guess I would encourage whoever suggested that they want these reports to send some snippets of XML so we can see, so we can try and nail down what it is they're reporting. Because I could imagine, particularly for ARC, a range from they used ARC to here's the entire details of all 473 bits of stuff in the ARC chain.
Right. Okay, let's move on to the next. DMARC failure reporting. So this is at this point is more experimental. Questions are for this: which fields should and should not be included? One strong man is just include from and to. Is it useful? What else people want or don't want to see there? Please come to the mic. Go ahead, Mary.
Is the question about the straw man is what must be included, what may be included? I haven't read the new document yet, but does anybody know whether we're talking about a minimal set of things that have to be included, or a full list of things that might be included, or some mix of those?
Both. I mean, what's the recommended minimum, as well as a reason to include or not to include more? And especially, obviously privacy considerations are going to be quite important for this document.
This is ripe for a privacy consideration section, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Todd?
Yeah, I don't see him on the call, but I know Jesse Thompson from University of Wisconsin has spoken in the past about his sort of straw man failure reporting and how it would be super helpful for him, who's at a large distributed system, to figure out just where the failures are coming from, to have that from into two. I don't like the idea of the failure report sent as failures occur. That just seems like a vector to be abused, simply from somebody forging mail and causing intentional DMARC failures. But something stripped down with just from and to, send at a regular interval like an aggregate report sounds reasonable, assuming people would actually consume the reports.
All right, thank you, Todd. Autumn?
Last IETF, I sent out a message to other folks on my team who also help people implement DMARC. And of course, everybody loves the full forensic reports, but there are some pieces that we are less in need of. So, for example, there are some providers that provide the full message. Obviously, most of the time we're working without that. That's fine. We also don't usually find ourselves in need of a full DKIM header, which is often in the results. We don't usually need a full date and timestamp. So a date is good, timestamp not necessarily required. I think my team most often that we do use the from address, and also the subject line is really important to us. Now, the subject line, I think, is one that is up in the air because of concerns over private data. But that is extraordinarily helpful. Again, the use case I'm seeing is a domain with many distinct email uses, many distinct vendors, and not a lot of visibility otherwise into what's being sent. So if you are a domain that only has a couple of uses of email, that's usually a little easier to figure out. But I've worked with domains that had 200 separate accounts and service providers sending email, and trying to track down who is responsible for that can be quite challenging. So that's why we use those. My team members also find the message ID helpful sometimes, because sometimes it provides insight into the back-end technology. Now, that's another question, I guess. What would be helpful for this is if we could find what specific fields people are really objecting to, because some of them are going to be a bigger deal than others, and I think there's potential trade-offs to be made. Is the concern really over possibly exposing infrastructure? If that's the case, then a message ID is something that should be up in the air. If that's less the case, then that's something that's very helpful, particularly for identifying abusive traffic as opposed to legitimate traffic. So I hope that's kind of a helpful set of pieces. Also, we do like the DKIM selector, and that's, of course, something we're suggesting in aggregate. The links, of course, are also very helpful, but again, I know that's something that people might be a little bit less comfortable sharing.
All right, thank you. Alwyn?
Yeah, so partially a comment regarding the traction around the failure reporting. So I think because the subject is so PII heavily ridden, a lot of implementers actually did directly said, well, we're not going to touch the subject until the privacy issues have been resolved. I definitely see real life use cases for having, in a way, abstracted reports with limited PII information. But then the headers regarding where the message originated from MTA-wise would be very interesting to have in there. Do not need the subject, to be honest, from a personal perspective, but having at least from the what is it, the domain part and the to domain part without the local part is would be fine from a specification perspective.
Right, thank you. Michael?
Yeah, so in the past, I've found the full failure reports, which we received as a contracted party. A lot of folks don't send them publicly. And just to give an example of how useful they can be, in total. Because we had control of our mail flows, essentially, if we looked at all of the URLs that we were sending from our own mail, subtracted those from the failure reports, all that was left was badness. And we actually used those links from the badness for shutting down the sites that are hosting malicious activity, abuse of our name, et cetera, et cetera. So it is very useful in getting rid of the badness. It's not just arbitrary failures. That's all I got.
Thank you. John?
I have to say, I don't entirely understand what problem we're trying to solve here. I mean, I'm looking at my folder full of failure reports. The vast majority of them come from two places, probably the same two places everybody else gets them. And what I see is that most of the failure reports have what appears to be the full header. And one Microsoft subsidiary sends the whole thing, which is very generous of them and kind of startling. But it seems to me that it's a local policy decision of what privacy issues you have, and I think we can come up with a complicated spec of some sort. But the reality is that most people won't send failure reports, and the ones that do will redact it to make their lawyers happy. So I don't see a whole lot of value in saying anything any more detail. Well, send whatever you feel you're able to send, and it would be nice if you sent along the from line and the message header, but we'll take what we can get.
Yeah, I think if we want to encourage more failure reporting, then having some text about what should be included and what you should consider at minimum, and why you should or should not include various things would be useful probably in the document.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure we are in a position to say, basically, we're talking to lawyers here, and I'm not sure there's anything we can say in the standard that says, oh, it's okay to send X, because they'll say, they have their own opinions about it. So I'm not opposed to doing this. I don't think we should put a whole lot of effort into it, because I think in reality, people are going to report what they're going to report.
So Kurt in the chat was saying, your suggestion sounds like a usage doc, not a spec. Well, the boundary is sometimes sort of a bit gray between these two. So right. Any other question? Any other comments on this? If not, let's move on. Right. This might be an interesting and long discussion or not. We'll see. So we had a discussion starting on that started on the mailing list about splitting out org domain to different documents, so that if we revise where it is, is it PSL or is it something else? If we change the mechanism how this is retrieved, then we wouldn't have to revise the DMARC base itself. Comments in favor, comments against this. Let's discuss. Yes, Dave. Dave, if you're talking, I'm not hearing anything. I can see you now. I don't hear you.
This probably works better now, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, you have to click twice. So since I made a proposal for a really firm split, I'm feeling obligated to at least repeat that. This is a messy, unpleasant topic with a bad history. It's a case of making do with what is generally viewed as a not very good or terrible solution, but it's the best that's available now. There are different approaches to making it a lot better. One of these days, one of them might actually prove successful and get adopted and work better. Baking anything into the core DMARC spec that relies on anything in particular happening it is just inherently risky. Having the spec state what it wants as a result, what's the nature of the information it wants, that makes sense because DMARC needs to use that information. Making any statements about how it gets the information is the problem. And I now don't remember who made the suggestion for some compromise text. I can't remember whether it was Murray or Barry or Kurt or whoever, but it was very clean, it was very simple, and it seemed to be plenty sufficient.
I'll take
Yes.
credit for that.
If people want to volunteer themselves on other people to be editors for this, please also let chairs know. You don't have to do it in a meeting if you're not comfortable with.
Well, my point was some text was offered. It was, I think, 2 sentences, and it seemed to me plenty sufficient. The first sentence said, we're not specifying it, and the second sentence said, by the way, there's some existing practice. I don't remember the exact language now, but it was along those lines. And the important part was it wasn't normative and it wasn't technical detail.
All right, thank you. John?
I'm going to shock you all and almost agree with Dave. I mean, on the mailing list, first I was saying, no, we shouldn't do this. And now I think we should. I just want to make sure that we agree that when we split this out into another document, it is possible that what we end up specifying as the org domain will not necessarily be the same domain that the current process finds. And in particular, if we do a tree walk, it won't be. I mean, I'm fine with that. I just want, if we're going to do this, I think we need to make sure that everybody understands that that's where this could lead.
Right, and this nicely leads to the next set of discussions we're going to have. Murray?
John's right, of course. My thought would be that we produce an org domain document that just is basically a transplant of the current PSL text from 7489 into something, and that's the thing that my proposed text referred to as this is the legacy thing everybody's been using for a while, but you can use other things as they appear. And then we might immediately generate another one that says, here's how you do it with the tree walk. You could put those two in a common document. How you organize that is really not important, I don't think. But I think it's going to be important to preserve what was there, but very clearly label it as, this is what we came up with originally. We don't love it. It served a purpose for a while. Watch for better things. And then the tree walk might follow on right immediately, and that might be the preferred thing.
Right. Kurt?
Yeah. Is it coming through?
Yes.
Yes, I think
hear you.
what makes more sense to talk about the policy discovery first, before we worry about whether or not an organizational domain is even relevant, because talking about splitting out a sub-spec of how to find an organizational domain when we potentially don't even care about an organizational domain because it's now obsolete seems like getting the cart before the horse.
There is that, but I think it sort of goes back to Murray or somebody's point that once we split it off, it might mutate into something else. So yes, these two issues are completely interlinked. All right.
Well, and I also don't think that it makes sense to have a separate document that says essentially, thanks for looking here about finding an org domain, but we don't care anymore because do a tree walk instead. And that, so I think we'd be better served as just an appendix in a new document that says, historically, here's how it's done. This is the way going forward, and not have a separate document, potentially. So I'm on the fence about a separate document per se.
Right. Any other comments? Well, if not, then let's talk about tree walk. So yeah, as already pointed out on the mailing, this solves some existing use cases like nested organizations, governments, universities, as well as top-level domains, which are currently explicitly prohibited. So please come to the mic and let's discuss. Autumn?
The nested organizations piece that you mentioned. So I've seen this a lot in higher education, and sadly Jesse's not here to join us, but this is a big issue that I see in almost every university I've worked with. For a while, I was working on a DMARC policy with an organization that was a particular grad school, and the grad school was part of a much larger university. And so their primary domain was effectively grad.university.edu. And then they had multiple subdomains of, english.grad.university.edu and tech.grad.university.edu. And for all of those, they really had wanted to be able to have a policy at grad.university.edu that could handle reporting, for example, for every possible subdomain out of what was their organization's primary domain. It just happened to be a subdomain of university.edu, and university.edu itself was not interested in implementing DMARC. So I don't know how often this use case occurs, but I do see it a lot with higher education and government as well. And that's where I think folks would be really happy to have something like this. Now, I can see where there could be a lot of downsides to performing effectively an infinite tree walk. I mean, how many levels out are we going to go before it causes serious load issues or what have you? But even allowing for 1 or 2 additional levels would be very helpful. Even just 1, I think, would make a big difference.
Yeah, I think some of the proposals were to limit how many you will do, and we'll obviously need to figure out what the number is. Right. Thank you. John?
Yeah, I went over and asked our friends in DNS land how much do they hate tree walks, because it used to be a total killer. And the response I got was like, oh yeah, whatever, which rather surprised me. And they pointed out that the CAA DNS record that's used for controlling TLS certificate issuance has specified a tree walk for 7 years. It was published in 2013. And I can tell you from experience arguing with certificate authorities that they actually do that. So I think if we, and and people said, and they said, yeah, you can do a 100-level thing, and I said, well, who has ever had an actual useful domain more than maybe 5 levels down, or maybe 10 levels down? So, and everybody seemed to say, yeah, it's like, okay, do a tree walk, and if you're worried about it, limit it to 5 levels. And then they had a couple of other little implementation tricks you might do to take advantage of the fact that if your DNS cache sees an NX domain at a certain level, then it can automatically tell you, without going back to the authoritative one, there's nothing below it. So, I mean, from an implementation point of view, and if you, I'd say do a tree walk for 5 levels and tell people if you want to have stuff more than 5 levels deep and get DMARC reports, then you better put, a DMARC record at least every 5 levels, and I think we're done. I mean, and the only issue here is sort of I take Autumn's point of view of the universities that I refer to as the Holy Roman Empire model of governance, and that they have and you basically you cannot tell from the structure of their DNS tree who's in charge of what. And the flip side is there are organizations where, by golly, their second level domain that they registered is their domain, and that's where all the reports should go. I mean, I don't know if there are people who feel really strongly about this, and that would be an argument for keeping something like the current organizational domain. Although the counter argument is like, well, then walk up and if that is a problem for you, then write a little script that walks up and down your DNS tree looking for rogue DMARC records and fix them.
Jim?
Hi. So I have to say that I'm rather amused by the idea of doing a tree walk here, because we discussed it extensively when we were doing ADSP, and it was just like, well, no, you can't possibly do a tree walk. It was considered, it was really toxic at the time. And I have to say, I mean, my recollection is that the objections to it didn't come from the DNS folks. It came from the people that are in this meeting. Anyhow, I still think the tree walk is a reasonable solution if it's limited. I don't think it needs to be very many levels. I don't think it's going to create a heavy load. But one thing that you do want to make sure that you have is that the record that you get to with the tree walk needs to have a flag in it to indicate whether it's intended to apply to lower layers, because otherwise, you might want to have a lower layer that doesn't have a policy or doesn't have a DMARC record, and a higher layer that does, and you don't want to essentially have, including the tree walk, make that happen unintentionally.
Thank you, Jim. Wes?
So, not a DMARC expert, do know a little bit about DNS on the other hand. So, a couple of things, and I'm not even sure I have an opinion on walking myself or not. I think if you asked a lot of people, you'd get, a bunch of different answers. In fact, if you asked 10 people, you'd get 11 answers, I'm sure. But as to whether it's actually, good or bad, I will point out a couple of things. One, the CAA example is one where it's done, but there's a huge amount of difference between the queries that will be generated by CAA searches, which are rare, versus those by mail servers actually doing DMARC. There's a significant difference in traffic. So queue name minimization is actually another way where we're actually increasing the load on the DNS by making more requests, and that's sort of a tree walk going downward. Ideally, the right thing to do is provide guidance at that point. And so if you have a lot of different, subdivisions within a university, for example, I'm at one, so I'm just as equally as guilty, right? We have a subdepartment that is inside of the major one. It'd be better if you could add a reference, right? To be able to say, and that reference could be, even possibly just a CNAME would work, of, I need my subdepartment to actually, I want you to go follow this policy somewhere else. And that way, you don't have to do a walk if you can point directly at it, right? You take out, that's a much more optimized solution in terms of both, the number of DNS requests required, as well as just simplicity of an algorithm. So I think that's all of my points. Thanks.
Thank you, Wes. any other comments? Anybody who wants to maybe have a strong feelings against DNS walk? Right, it doesn't look like we have any takers. And this was the last slide. So are there any other topics that people would like to discuss in this meeting? Sorry, the interface is a bit, it's hard for me to switch between chat and seeing who wants to talk. So it doesn't look like anybody wants to come to the mic and bring up any other topics. So in this case, let's wrap it up. I hope this was useful. I certainly learned a few things. We should have good notes, and we'll take discussions to the mailing list. Thank you all for coming.